The Munich Security Conference is not a backdrop for applause lines, and it is not a rehearsal stage for domestic political branding. It is a tribunal of competence where every word is weighed by people who command divisions, shape sanctions, and authorize force that redraws borders. In Washington, a mistake can be softened by a friendly network hit before lunch and buried under trending outrage by nightfall. In Munich, a mistake is delivered into a room that contains the German defense minister, the president of France, the Secretary General of NATO, and dozens of foreign ministers who have built careers on identifying weakness. When you err in that room, the correction does not come from Twitter. It comes from silence. And silence in diplomacy is a verdict. Alexandria. Ocasio-Cortez traveled to Munich with the unmistakable air of someone who believed she was stepping into history. She carried 6 million Instagram followers, a portfolio of viral committee moments, and the confidence of a politician who had not yet met a room she could not command. She had slogans that filled rallies and a media instinct honed in domestic combat, and she possessed the most recognizable face in her party's progressive wing. She had energy that translated on camera and a story that resonated across demographics. What she did not have was an answer for Taiwan, and the man across from her knew it before she ever touched the microphone. The Bayerischer Hof is not Capitol Hill, and it does not indulge theatrics disguised as substance. There are no activists shouting from a balcony, no scrolling graphics cushioning a stumble, no staffers holding up prompts when the thread is lost. When you stand at that podium, the people listening have negotiated ceasefires and calibrated sanctions with consequences measured in lives. They do not applaud because they share your politics. They applaud when you demonstrate mastery. They recognize the difference between conviction and comprehension faster than any domestic audience in the world. For 4 decades, Munich has hosted every type of American official, from vice presidents fluent in treaty language to senators who memorized the architecture of deterrence. It has watched generals outline force posture with clinical precision, and diplomats navigate trade-offs in real time. It has also seen less prepared figures falter under scrutiny, but never on a weekend billed as a proving ground for future leadership. It had never seen a 36-year-old congresswoman arrive with an iPhone story filmed over the Atlantic, and the implicit assumption that social media momentum equaled foreign policy depth. That was the experiment unfolding on Friday morning. Ocasio-Cortez entered the hall in a tailored charcoal blazer and gold earrings, framed by aides carrying briefing binders assembled during 8 hours of compressed preparation. Her communications director hovered close enough to capture behind-the-scenes footage, curating a narrative before a single question had been asked. She waved to younger European parliamentarians who had celebrated her arrival online and paused for photographers from major outlets. She looked like a candidate, confident she was about to deliver a defining performance. She radiated anticipation. Marco Rubio was already seated, having arrived a day earlier from meetings in Ankara with the Turkish foreign minister. He wore a navy suit without a tie, a small concession to European informality, and he sat with a glass of water, a pen, and a single notepad. There was no visible entourage, no glowing screens, no choreography. He had attended Munich 6 times as a senator, and twice now as Secretary of State. He knew the delegates by name and, more importantly, by interest, understanding which governments feared Moscow, which recalibrated toward Beijing, and which were balancing both pressures simultaneously. The panel was titled "The Future of American Leadership," and 800 people filled the room while cameras from every major network recorded what many expected to be a generational clash. The Europeans had come with 2 questions in mind. Would Rubio temper the sharper edges of the administration's rhetoric? And was Ocasio-Cortez more than a domestic phenomenon? She spoke first, at her own request, and she delivered what she has always delivered effectively. Indictment. She turned not to Rubio, but to the audience, framing her remarks as a moral confrontation rather than a policy debate. She invoked Greenland, NATO, the Kurds, Kim Jong-un, and Ukraine in rapid succession, constructing a narrative of an administration that she argued had undermined alliances. Her voice rose with practiced cadence, and the room leaned forward, drawn to the confidence even if unconvinced by the framing. She accused, she contrasted, she appealed to shared values across the Atlantic. The applause came, especially from progressive factions in the room, and the press began typing before she concluded. She sat back with visible satisfaction, posture signaling that she believed she had seized the stage. Rubio did not bristle. He did not counter with volume or indignation. He smiled with the composure of someone accustomed to being accused in more volatile settings. When the moderator invited his response, he thanked her for her passion and paused just long enough to reset the temperature of the room. Then, he referenced a remark she had made the day before about Venezuela being below the equator and stated calmly that Caracas sits at 10 degrees north latitude. He did not dramatize the correction. He simply noted that she had discussed foreign policy toward a nation without knowing which hemisphere it occupied. He added that this was not Twitter and that geography has consequences. The room did not laugh. It recalibrated. Silence spread with the weight of recognition that a basic fact had been mishandled on a stage that does not forgive imprecision. In Munich, that kind of silence signals that the evaluation has begun. What followed was not a rebuttal speech but an examination. Rubio shifted from declarative defense to interrogative precision, asking who currently leads Honduras. There was no immediate answer. He asked who leads the opposition in Venezuela, and when she named Maria Corina Machado, he acknowledged it before pressing further. Had she spoken with her, advocated for her specifically, referenced her in a substantive way before that moment? The questions were not hostile, they were exact. He stated that he had spoken with Machado 5 times in 6 months, and that the wife of Leopoldo Lopez contacted his office weekly. He contrasted democracy as a slogan with democracy as a risk carried in hiding. The point was not stylistic, it was structural. Policy is built on engagement, not expression. The room shifted again, not dramatically but perceptibly. Ocasio-Cortez attempted to reassert her record of speaking out against authoritarian regimes. Rubio narrowed the lens further, asking whether she had introduced legislation targeting Maduro's financial networks, whether she had called for specific sanctions on military commanders, whether she had met with Colombian officials managing 3 million refugees. Each question exposed the difference between denunciation and design. There were no raised voices. There was only the accumulation of absence. He then moved to climate policy, praising the ambition before asking which European country had reduced emissions most significantly while maintaining growth. She mentioned Germany. He cited France, noting its reliance on nuclear energy and the emissions reductions achieved alongside economic expansion. He pointed out that the Green New Deal opposed the very technology that had delivered those results. The implication was not ideological, but empirical. He framed the gap as one between branding and architecture, between a political identity constructed around climate justice and the practical mechanics of achieving it. Several French delegates nodded, not theatrically, but affirmatively. The message was clear. Policy claims require familiarity with outcomes. That familiarity had not been demonstrated. The applause lines from earlier had faded into a quieter, more consequential assessment. Rubio then pivoted to security in the Pacific, asking the question that had hovered over the conference. Would the United States defend Taiwan if China invaded? He quoted her prior answer, 30 seconds of hesitation framed by generalities. He did not mimic her tone. He repeated the substance. 23 million people live in Taiwan, he said, and their fate depends on clarity, not filler. She invoked strategic ambiguity, and he responded that invoking it requires understanding its foundation. He asked about the Taiwan Relations Act of 1979, who signed it, what commitments it codified. There was a pause, measured in seconds, but felt as an inflection point. In a room filled with officials who had studied that statute for decades, the silence carried weight. It was not cruelty. It was consequence. By the time he filled the silence with the answer himself, noting President Carter's signature and the commitment to provide defensive arms and treat coercion as a matter of grave concern, the contrast had hardened. This was not classified knowledge. It was foundational. The examination had established its thesis without theatrics. Charisma does not substitute for command of detail in rooms where detail defines survival. The opening 40 minutes had answered the Europeans' question. The Instagram phenomenon had encountered the architecture of statecraft. The room had listened, measured, and begun to decide. And the decision was forming not in applause, but in the quiet exchange of glances that signal a recalibration of expectations. The moderator shifted in his chair, sensing that what was unfolding was no longer a debate, but an audit. The air inside the hall felt denser, not because voices had risen, but because the standard had. 800 people were no longer watching a clash of ideologies. They were watching a measurement of readiness. Rubio had not humiliated. He had not mocked. He had not postured. He had simply applied pressure where knowledge should have been. Ocasio-Cortez leaned forward, attempting to reclaim terrain with the language she knew best. She reiterated the moral stakes, the need to defend democracy, the urgency of confronting authoritarianism wherever it appeared. The words were forceful, polished, and emotionally coherent. But the room had shifted into a different mode, one where urgency required architecture. Rhetoric had been weighed and found lighter than the questions demanded. Rubio did not interrupt her cadence. He waited, as someone accustomed to negotiations waits for the moment when the other side has finished performing. Then he resumed not with accusation, but with another question that tightened the frame further. He asked whether she could articulate the specific statutory obligations embedded in the Taiwan Relations Act beyond the phrase strategic ambiguity. The inquiry was clinical, almost academic. She attempted to reframe again, emphasizing the importance of coalition building and diplomatic signaling. But the issue was no longer coalition building. It was command of fact. In a room where generals had memorized the language of deterrence and diplomats had debated every clause of Pacific policy, the absence of specificity was not subtle. It was structural, and structure is what Munich measures. The moderator attempted to steer the conversation toward Ukraine, perhaps hoping to relieve the pressure that had accumulated. Rubio was invited to outline the current state of transatlantic coordination. He spoke in measured, operational terms, referencing a recent call with President Zelensky, citing production figures for ammunition, naming specific weapons systems and delivery timelines. His cadence was calm, his detail granular. He described European production of 155mm artillery shells at 40,000 per month against a Ukrainian need of 200,000. He translated the gap into consequence, stating that every missing round corresponded to territory lost. He did not dramatize. He quantified. The arithmetic hung in the air like a map drawn in numbers. In that room, arithmetic is authority. When the moderator turned to Ocasio-Cortez and asked for her assessment of European defense industrial capacity, she answered with conviction, but without measurement. She spoke of standing firmly with Ukraine, of resisting imperial aggression, of unity between the United States and Europe. The sentiment was correct. The sentiment was insufficient. The moderator pressed politely for figures. She acknowledged that she did not have the exact numbers in front of her. Rubio supplied them again, quietly, not triumphantly. 40,000 produced, 200,000 needed, 160,000 short. He described the deficit as a line item of survival. The difference between rhetoric and readiness became visible not through hostility, but through contrast. The delegates began to signal their evaluation not with applause, but with attention drift. A Finnish defense minister glanced at his phone. Two German parliamentarians leaned together in whispered exchange. A French diplomat opened his briefing folder. These gestures were not disrespect. They were diagnosis. At Munich, disengagement is a verdict rendered without words. The discussion moved to Latin America, and a Colombian delegate addressed Rubio in Spanish. The choice was natural in a room with simultaneous translation, but it carried symbolic weight. Rubio answered in fluent, policy-dense Spanish, the cadence of Miami layered with diplomatic precision. He referenced migration flows, border coordination, and financial stabilization in language that required both vocabulary and familiarity. The exchange lasted minutes and demonstrated not performance, but competence. When the moderator invited Ocasio-Cortez to respond in Spanish, referencing the demographics of her district, she declined, describing her Spanish as conversational and choosing English. There was nothing inherently disqualifying in that choice. Yet the juxtaposition had already formed its own narrative. The Secretary of State had just conducted substantive hemispheric diplomacy in Spanish. The Congresswoman representing a district nearly half Latino could not engage at that level. The words she offered in English were again morally aligned, speaking of partnership and solidarity. But the room had witnessed the difference between fluency in language and fluency in policy. That distinction lingered. Then came the moment that would be remembered beyond the statistics and beyond the statutes. The moderator suggested a brief pause before moving to the next topic, perhaps sensing the tension that had accumulated. Rubio shook his head slightly and asked for a moment to say something not about policy. The tonal shift was immediate and palpable. He began by noting that he and Ocasio-Cortez shared something in common. They had both tended bar. The recalibration in the room was almost audible. This was not a line anyone had prepared for, not an angle the press had predicted. It was a pivot from examination to origin, from statute to story. He acknowledged her trajectory from bartender to congresswoman as a real and admirable American narrative. He stated that he respected it. Then he spoke of his father, who had tended bar in Miami for 40 years, not as a prelude to something larger, but as the entirety of his career. He described his father's hands, rough and cracked, polished by decades of work. He recounted asking his father as a child why he never complained. He repeated his father's answer about Cuba taking everything, about America allowing a man to work and keep what he earned. He emphasized the word enough, not as complacency, but as gratitude. The story was not theatrical. It was precise in its humility. He contrasted their conclusions drawn from similar starting points. She had tended bar and concluded the system required reconstruction. His father had tended bar and concluded the system was a miracle worth protecting. He framed the difference not as partisan, but philosophical. It was a contrast between rupture and preservation. The room grew still in a way that was not political, but human. A Cuban-born Spanish ambassador in the second row removed his glasses and stared upward, recognizing a narrative that paralleled his own family history. This was not applause-seeking. It was memory invoked in a room where many carried similar stories. It shifted the conversation from critique to foundation. Ocasio-Cortez responded with respect, referencing her own working-class background and the loss of her father. Rubio expressed sympathy without irony. Then he delivered the line that crystallized the afternoon's argument. Loss is not policy. Pain is not expertise. He stated that she had built a political brand from her story, and that the brand had propelled her further than many expected. But when the brand met a question about geography or a statute about Taiwan, it fractured. A brand is not knowledge, and knowledge is the currency of that stage. No one laughed. No one clapped. The statement hung in the air with the severity of an indictment delivered without raised voice. The difference between domestic politics and international security had been defined in a single sentence. The examination was no longer about a hemisphere or an emissions statistic. It was about readiness. The panel continued, but the dynamic had altered irreversibly. Every subsequent answer from Ocasio-Cortez was filtered through the earlier silences. Every response from Rubio carried the weight of demonstrated familiarity. The moderator's tone grew more deliberate, aware that what had begun as a debate had become a lesson in expectations. As the session entered its second hour, the delegates were no longer testing ideology. They were measuring whether the Congresswoman could translate conviction into command. Each question about NATO burden sharing, about Chinese naval expansion, about sanctions architecture, was an opportunity. Each answer that lacked detail reinforced the pattern. By the time the panel concluded, the outcome was not declared, but understood. Munich does not announce winners. It absorbs performances and categorizes them. It distinguishes between those who arrived with preparation embedded and those who arrived with preparation assembled. The first day had delivered its answer. The question of whether Ocasio-Cortez was real on the world stage had been asked in full view of the world. The answer had emerged not through humiliation, but through measurement. And in that room, measurement is final. When the panel finally adjourned, the applause was polite and brief, the kind extended out of courtesy rather than conviction. The delegates rose not with the buzz of excitement that follows a breakthrough, but with the quiet efficiency of professionals already calculating their next conversation. Munich does not linger on spectacle. It moves immediately to consequence. The cocktail reception that evening in the main salon of the Bayerischer Hof was where the real hierarchy would be revealed. In that room, alliances are not declared on stage. They are formed in clusters, in corners, in conversations measured in minutes, but weighted with years. The German foreign minister approached Rubio within seconds, followed by the Japanese ambassador, the Polish defense minister, and the EU high representative. Each waited for a sliver of time with a man they had just watched demonstrate command. Rubio did not chase them. He did not angle for cameras. He simply stood and listened, nodding, taking mental notes, trading specifics. The conversations were brief but dense, anchored in policy rather than performance. Around him, a quiet orbit formed, the kind that signals relevance without proclamation. Ocasio-Cortez's staff moved through the room with professional urgency, attempting to secure bilateral moments that would counter the narrative forming outside the hall. They approached the Polish defense minister and were told his schedule was full. They approached the Japanese ambassador and were informed he had a meeting with the Secretary of State. They approached a German social democrat, ideologically aligned on domestic issues, and received a courteous deferral. "It was a pleasure hearing you speak," one diplomat said, the sentence delivered with impeccable politeness. In European diplomatic language, that phrase is the velvet glove covering the absence of follow-up. It is encouragement without commitment. It is applause without consequence. No one was rude. No one smirked. The rejection was not dramatic. It was structural. At Munich, the measure of influence is who seeks you out after the microphones are turned off. On that evening, the gravitational pull was unmistakable. Ocasio-Cortez stood near the bar, an irony that would not be lost on commentators later, holding a glass of mineral water while watching the room's choreography. Her communications director typed and erased messages, searching for a framing that would survive the coming news cycle. The staff's body language was composed, but the rhythm of the room had already set. Absence, not insult, was the verdict. Saturday morning arrived with a different configuration on stage. The panel titled Transatlantic Security Architecture in the Age of Multipolarity listed 2 chairs with 2 nameplates, Secretary Rubio and Representative Ocasio-Cortez. When the moderator opened the session, he announced that the Congresswoman had been called back to Washington due to scheduling conflicts. The murmur that followed was restrained but knowing. European press had already published overnight analyses dissecting the prior day's exchange. Headlines referenced foreign policy gaps and substance deficits. The image of the empty chair began forming before a camera had even captured it. Rubio did not comment on her absence. He did not allude to it, did not tease it, did not frame it. He simply answered questions. He outlined NATO force posture adjustments, Chinese naval expansion patterns in the Pacific, the future of the Iran nuclear framework, and African Union partnerships with specific references to dates, commitments, and contingency plans. Midway through the session, a young German journalist asked about the previous day's clash and whether Rubio had any reaction. He paused for 3 seconds, the kind of pause that signals thought, rather than hesitation. Then he said he did not have fireworks. He had work. He gestured lightly toward the empty chair and stated that the questions remained. The phrase traveled faster than any applause line. A Reuters photographer framed the scene wide, Rubio leaning forward, notepad in hand, mid-sentence, and beside him the unoccupied chair with Ocasio-Cortez's nameplate still visible. Behind them, the blue Munich Security Conference banner stretched across the stage. The photograph required no caption. By the afternoon, European outlets ran the image prominently. Some used a single word to describe it: absent. Others paired it with commentary about the gap between rhetoric and readiness. The symbolism was unavoidable. The narrative solidified not because of an insult, but because of an absence. Ocasio-Cortez had come to audition for leadership on the global stage. The global stage had proceeded without her. Back in New York, her team worked to reframe the trip as a moral stand rather than a technical test. Statements emphasized that she had gone to sound the alarm about inequality and the erosion of alliances. The line about not being quizzed on geography appeared in social media posts designed to project defiance. But the internet is not kind to factual error. Clips circulated rapidly. The Venezuela correction traveled first, not because it was partisan, but because it was clear. Geography teachers shared it. Policy students shared it. The line did not require spin. The Taiwan silence followed, edited into a split screen with Rubio's statement about 23 million people counting on American clarity. It was translated into Mandarin and posted on Taiwanese platforms. It accumulated views not as entertainment, but as concern. The bartender's speech moved differently. It did not spike. It seeped. It was shared in Cuban communities first, then among immigrant circles, then among viewers who recognized their own fathers in the story of rough hands and gratitude. Cable news amplified the confrontation. Conservative hosts replayed the geography and Taiwan moments. Commentators described the exchange as an exposure of depth. Even outlets typically sympathetic to Ocasio-Cortez questioned whether the trip had backfired. President Trump posted on social media that Rubio had dominated, framing it as a victory for his administration. Vice President Vance echoed the sentiment in a brief press gaggle, calling the exchange embarrassing for anyone who believed she was ready for the world stage. The rhetoric was predictable. The silence from within her own party was more telling. Democratic leadership offered no robust defense. There were no extended statements praising her performance. The Congressional Progressive Caucus issued a mild note about the importance of dialogue. Governors and senators who had attended Munich themselves remained quiet. In presidential politics, silence is calculus. Potential rivals understood that if she stumbled, they advanced. There are no allies in a primary, only trajectories. Strategists spoke off the record about a missed opportunity. One Democratic strategist described the trip as a beauty pageant that required foreign policy chops and concluded that the chops were not demonstrated. The phrase prime time began appearing in commentary. Even daytime talk shows noted that she had lacked a recovery moment. Critics from the right were harsher, invoking ignorance about Taiwan's history and broader geopolitical context. Religious commentators criticized her framing of class struggle on a global stage. The damage was not confined to ideological opponents. 3 weeks later, polling reflected a drop in favorability among likely primary voters. The question of qualification registered a majority negative. Among older voters, the skepticism was more pronounced. The Munich trip had been structured to prove readiness. It had instead illuminated a gap. The narrative was not built on scandal or cruelty. It was built on comparison. Rubio left Munich Saturday afternoon without attending the closing reception. He boarded a plane to Ankara for a meeting about Syrian refugee resettlement, an issue measured in millions of lives. His deputy mentioned the viral clip counts. He asked to turn it off and requested the briefing for President Erdogan instead. The laptop closed. The briefing book opened. That contrast, more than any exchange on stage, defined the weekend. One politician had come for the cameras. The other had come for the work. Rubio called his wife from the plane, asked about the children and the dog, and laughed. When she said she had seen the clips, he responded that the fight had not been fair and that he wished it had been. He took no visible pleasure in the outcome. Dismantling someone unprepared is not triumph, it is confirmation. But the room in Munich does not adjust its standard to spare ambition. His father's lesson echoed in the subtext. In America, nobody cares where you start, but they care whether you show up ready. Always show up ready. Rubio opened the Turkey briefing book. In 9 hours, he would sit across from Erdogan to discuss 3 million Syrian refugees whose futures hinged on details. He read, "In Miami, that same Saturday night, a 17-year-old named Sophia watched the clips on her laptop. Her parents had arrived from Nicaragua years earlier and built a life through steady work. She had admired Ocasio-Cortez, shared her speeches, mirrored her style. Watching the exchange, she felt something unexpected. Not anger, not glee, embarrassment. Because identity without preparation had been exposed in a room that demanded more. She watched the empty chair, and then watched Rubio answer questions alone. She saw the difference between viral and durable. When the clips ended, she did not open social media. She searched how to apply for the Foreign Service exam. She did not know where it would lead. She knew only that if she ever walked into a room like Munich, she would do the reading first. The story did not end with the photograph, and it did not end with the polling shift 3 weeks later. It settled into something more durable, something that outlasts headlines and survives beyond partisan spin. Munich had applied a standard that cannot be negotiated, and that standard is knowledge under pressure. The world stage does not reward fluency in indignation. It rewards fluency in consequence. In the days that followed, the narrative hardened not because conservatives repeated it, but because neutral observers recognized what they had seen. The geography correction was not partisan. The Taiwan silence was not ideological. The artillery arithmetic was not rhetorical. Each moment existed independently of party affiliation, anchored in facts that could be checked in seconds. The phrase substance gap began appearing in European commentary, not as an insult, but as a diagnosis. Diplomats are careful with language, and when they choose a phrase repeatedly, it signals consensus. Ocasio-Cortez had not been ridiculed. She had been measured. The measurement had not favored her. Inside Democratic circles, the reaction was restrained but unmistakable. There were no surrogates flooding networks to insist she had dominated. There were no extended interviews defending her grasp of Pacific security. There was instead a cautious recalibration, a pivot toward domestic strengths and away from international ambition. Strategists spoke quietly about timing. They referenced the 2028 horizon as a field still forming, as a race in which perception of readiness would matter more than viral resonance. The Munich performance became a reference point in private conversations, shorthand for a vulnerability that could not be ignored. The silence from party leadership was not oversight, it was strategy. Ocasio-Cortez continued to defend her trip publicly, emphasizing that she had challenged the administration's approach and centered moral urgency. She argued that quizzing her on geography obscured deeper failures in global leadership. The framing was coherent within her brand. It did not alter the impression left in Munich. The Quinnipiac poll 3 weeks later quantified what diplomats had already intuited. Favorability among likely primary voters dropped 11 points. 53% said she was not qualified to be president. Among voters over 50, that number climbed to 68%. Polls are snapshots, not verdicts, but they reveal momentum. The trip designed to demonstrate readiness had introduced doubt. Doubt is more corrosive than criticism because it lingers. Rubio, meanwhile, did not reference Munich again publicly. He attended meetings, delivered briefings, negotiated frameworks. His deputy occasionally mentioned the viral numbers, and he occasionally asked to move on. The contrast that defined the weekend extended into the weeks that followed. In Ankara, he discussed refugee resettlement numbers and border logistics with Erdogan, focusing on timelines and coordination rather than applause lines. He did not reference trending clips in 12 countries. He asked for the brief and read it. The bartender speech resurfaced periodically, clipped into segments that resonated with immigrant communities and older voters who recognized their own fathers in the description of rough hands and gratitude. It did not trend in spikes. It circulated steadily. It reminded viewers that origin can shape worldview without excusing ignorance. The line about showing up ready became a quiet refrain among commentators who valued preparation over posture. It was not weaponized as a slogan. It functioned as a principle. Munich had enforced it without malice. In progressive circles, some argued that the standard itself was biased. that foreign policy rooms were structured to favor those steeped in establishment networks. The argument had intellectual merit. It did not change the reality that the room exists and that decisions made there shape outcomes for millions. The international order does not pause for candidates to catch up. It moves according to events, not ambitions. The Pacific balance of power does not soften because a politician has a compelling domestic narrative. Ammunition shortages do not disappear because the language of solidarity is eloquent. Sophia in Miami did not think in those abstract terms. She thought about the moment when silence filled the hall after the Taiwan question. She thought about how quickly admiration can shift to reassessment. She did not see cruelty. She saw expectation. Her search for the Foreign Service exam was not an act of partisanship. It was an act of aspiration. She wanted to enter rooms like Munich equipped with more than conviction. She told her father that she had been watching the conference clips. He nodded and said that if she wanted to represent America abroad, she needed to know the history and the statutes before she opened her mouth. He did not mention Rubio. He did not mention Ocasio-Cortez. He mentioned readiness. Back in Washington, Ocasio-Cortez returned to committee work, to domestic policy battles where her fluency remained formidable. She did not abandon ambition. She adjusted her messaging, emphasizing economic justice and climate once more. The Munich episode lingered as a chapter rather than a conclusion. Political careers are long. Reputations can be rebuilt. But certain images endure. The empty chair beside Rubio became one of those images. It appeared in campaign ads and opinion pieces, in think tank presentations and strategy memos. It symbolized not humiliation, but absence. Absence in a room that defines presence carries meaning. It suggests retreat rather than recalibration. It invites speculation rather than applause. Rubio's line about not having fireworks but having work echoed in foreign policy circles. It encapsulated the difference between spectacle and substance without explicitly condemning either. It defined the terms of engagement. Munich did not crown a victor. It did not declare a defeat. It demonstrated the gap between aspiration and preparation in a venue that tolerates neither error nor excess. Ocasio-Cortez's supporters argued that she would learn, that no politician begins with mastery of every region and every statute. That is true. Experience accumulates. The question Munich posed was not whether she could learn. It was whether she had arrived ready for that particular audition. The answer, as measured by silence and absence, was no. Rubio did not celebrate. He did not reference the silence as triumph. He returned to briefings and meetings and family calls. His father's lesson remained in the background, not as nostalgia, but as discipline. Show up ready. Sophia studied for her exam, reading statutes and treaties, learning the geography of places she had only seen on screens. She understood that rooms like Munich do not reward volume. They reward command. The world stage is not cruel. It is exacting. It does not adjust its expectations to accommodate narrative. Munich had applied its expectation evenly. It had revealed the difference between branding and briefing books, the difference between performance and preparation, the difference between trending and trusted. The lesson was not partisan. It was structural. In rooms where nuclear arsenals and refugee counts are discussed, charisma does not compensate for omission. It amplifies it. Ocasio-Cortez had entered believing that confidence could carry her through any arena. She left having encountered a room where confidence without command is not enough. Rubio had entered as Secretary of State and left as the same, having neither overplayed nor underplayed his hand. He had answered questions, asked questions, and told a story about his father. The weekend became a case study in what the world stage demands. It demands familiarity with statutes, numbers, names, and consequences. It demands that when asked about Taiwan, you know not only the slogan, but the act, not only the sentiment, but the signature. It demands that when asked about emissions, you know which country achieved reductions and how. It demands that when you invoke democracy, you know the names of those risking their lives to defend it. It demands readiness. Munich had not been a trap. It had been a mirror. What it reflected was not malice, but measurement. And measurement, once rendered, cannot be undone by a post or a pivot. The free world had watched. It had listened. It had recalibrated. And the standard remained unchanged.